Is this a joke, Mr. Washington? You're citing a Wikipedia article to my courtroom? Judge Nicole Simmons scoffed, her laughter echoing against the mahogany walls, prompting snickers from the expensive corporate lawyers. Dennis Washington stood tall, adjusting his cheap thrift store suit. He didn't flinch. No, Your Honor. I am citing Title 18, U.S. Code, Section 1346. And if you read the footnote on page 4 of my motion, you'll realize I'm not just defending my property, I'm submitting evidence of your federal indictment. The laughter stopped. The courtroom froze. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 3B felt more like the gates of purgatory to anyone who couldn't afford a $500 an hour attorney. For Dennis Washington, a 34-year-old high school history teacher, those doors represented the last stand for his family's legacy. He walked down the center aisle, the worn soles of his shoes making a quiet, rhythmic thud against the polished marble floor. His suit, bought at a local Goodwill and tailored by his own hand, hung neatly but lacked the sharp, aggressive cut of the men sitting at the plaintiff's table. At the bench sat Judge Nicole Simmons. She was a woman who wore her authority not as a mantle of justice, but as a crown of absolute power. With her perfectly coiffed hair, designer reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, and a permanent expression of mild distaste, she was notorious in the district. She favored the elite, the wealthy, and the connected. To her, a pro se litigant, someone representing themselves, was nothing more than a nuisance clogging up her pristine docket. Case number 44CV809, Apex Horizon Development vs. Washington Estate, the bailiff announced, his voice booming across the half-empty gallery. Dennis approached the defendant's table. Across the aisle, Arthur Vance, a silver-haired shark from the city's most ruthless corporate law firm, barely looked up from his iPad. Vance was representing Apex Horizon, a multi-million-dollar real estate conglomerate aggressively attempting to seize Dennis's late mother's property, a prime piece of downtown real estate, through a convoluted, borderline fraudulent eminent domain loophole. They claimed the property was blighted and that Dennis owed hundreds of thousands in obscure municipal code violations that Apex had somehow purchased the debt for. It was a classic corporate land grab, designed to financially bleed the victim until they surrendered. Are we ready to proceed, Mr. Vance? Judge Simmons asked, her tone dripping with professional courtesy. We are, Your Honor. And we anticipate this will be exceedingly brief, Vance replied with a slick, confident smile. The defense has no legal standing, no valid response to our summary judgment motion, and frankly, no business wasting this court's valuable time. Judge Simmons turned her gaze to Dennis. It was the look one might give a cockroach that had wandered onto a pristine dining table. Mr. Washington. I see you are still unrepresented. I warned you 3 weeks ago that playing lawyer would end poorly for you. I am representing myself, Your Honor. As is my right under the law, Dennis replied, his voice steady, deep, and remarkably calm. He carefully placed a thick, neatly tabbed binder onto the table. Your right to make a fool of yourself is indeed protected by the Constitution, Simmons shot back, eliciting a chorus of chuckles from Vance and his junior associates. I have reviewed your paperwork. I use that term loosely. It is a scattered mess of grievances. Mr. Vance has filed a motion for summary judgment to seize the property and compel you to pay their legal fees. Do you have an actual legal defense, or just more emotional rambling? I have a defense, Your Honor, Dennis said, opening his binder, and I have a counter-motion for dismissal with prejudice, citing fraudulent filings by the plaintiff. Judge Simmons actually threw her head back and laughed. It was a sharp, mocking sound that bounced off the mahogany walls. Fraudulent filings? A high school teacher is going to lecture Arthur Vance on legal filings? Mr. Washington, this isn't a television show. You can't just shout fraud because you're losing your mother's house. Mr. Vance went to Harvard Law. Where did you get your legal degree? The back of a cereal box? The junior lawyers at the plaintiff's table openly snickered. The court reporter even cracked a smile. It was an orchestrated humiliation, designed to break Dennis's spirit. They expected him to stutter, to get angry, to lash out, which would give Simmons the excuse to hold him in contempt and end the case right there. But Dennis didn't flush with anger. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked up from his binder, his dark eyes locking onto the judge with a chilling, unshakable focus. "I didn't go to law school, Your Honor," Dennis said, his voice cutting through the fading laughter like a razor blade. "But I did learn how to read. And more importantly, I learned how to count, and when I started counting the discrepancies in Mr. Vance's property assessments, the math led me somewhere very interesting." Judge Simmons' smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered her sneer. "Proceed, Mr. Washington. Entertain us. But be warned, you have exactly 10 minutes before I grant the plaintiff's motion and order your eviction." What Judge Simmons and Arthur Vance did not know was that Dennis Washington had not spent the last 6 months mourning in self-pity. When Apex Horizon first filed their aggressive lawsuit, Dennis had tried to hire a lawyer. Every single attorney he consulted took one look at the opposing counsel, saw the name Judge Nicole Simmons on the docket, and politely declined the case. They all told him the same thing: the system in this county was rigged. Apex owned the local political machine, and Simmons was their judicial rubber stamp. Left with no other option, Dennis turned his dining room into a war room. He spent every night after grading history papers buried in the local university's law library. He didn't just read basic property law, he devoured the rules of civil procedure, the federal rules of evidence, and complex corporate structuring. Dennis possessed a uniquely analytical mind. He applied this exact historical methodology to Apex Horizon development. He noticed a pattern. Over the last 5 years, Apex had successfully seized 14 properties in the downtown corridor using the exact same aggressive tactic, citing obscure, decades-old municipal code violations, claiming blight, and forcing a summary judgment. And in all 14 cases, the presiding judge was Nicole Simmons. Dennis dug deeper. He went to the county clerk's office and pulled the deed transfers for those 14 properties. After Apex seized them, they were uniformly transferred to a holding company called Crestview Holdings LLC. Dennis then spent weeks tracing the corporate veil of Crestview Holdings. It was a labyrinth of shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. But Dennis was relentless. He finally found a weak link, a careless mistake. One of the subsidiary LLCs under Crestview had filed a routine tax form 3 years prior, and the registered agent listed on the document wasn't a corporate proxy. It was an individual. A man named Richard Simmons. Richard Simmons was Judge Nicole Simmons' husband. Dennis realized he wasn't fighting a legal battle, he was fighting a criminal enterprise. The corporation was identifying vulnerable properties, creating fake violations, and using Judge Simmons to rubber stamp the seizures. In return, the properties were being funneled into a shell company controlled by her own husband. But knowing the truth and proving it in court were two entirely different things. Dennis knew that if he simply blurted out this accusation, Simmons would immediately hold him in contempt, strike his statements from the record, and throw him in jail for slander. He needed to trap her. He needed to make her admission part of the official, unsealable court record, and he needed to do it using ironclad legal procedure. To build this trap, Dennis turned to a real, landmark Supreme Court precedent, Caperton v. A.T. Massey Coal Co. In this case, the Supreme Court ruled that a judge must recuse themselves when there is a serious, objective risk of actual bias, specifically when financial interests are involved. Dennis drafted his trap meticulously. He didn't file his explosive evidence in his initial response. He kept it hidden. Instead, 3 weeks before the trial, Dennis quietly filed a subpoena duces tecum, a legal writ demanding the production of specific documents directed not at Apex Horizon, but at the regional branch of First National Bank, requesting the wire transfer records of Crestview Holdings. Because Dennis filed it properly formatted under the obscure Rule 45 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, and because the court clerk processed it as a routine administrative action, it slipped entirely under Judge Simmons' radar. Back in the courtroom, the 10-minute timer was ticking. "Your Honor," Dennis began, pacing slowly in front of his table. "The plaintiff claims my property is blighted due to structural instability, citing an engineering report authored by a Mr. David Kellerman. I would like to call Mr. Kellerman to the stand for cross-examination regarding his affidavit." Vance rolled his eyes and stood up. "Objection, Your Honor." Mr. Kellerman's affidavit is already entered into evidence. This is a summary judgment hearing. A full cross-examination is unnecessary and a waste of the court's time. Judge Simmons waved her hand dismissively. Sustained. Move along, Mr. Washington. I'm not bringing an engineer down here just so you can ask him basic questions you don't understand. Your Honor, Dennis countered swiftly, his voice ringing with authority. Under the Federal Rules of Evidence, Rule 801, an out-of-court statement offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted is hearsay. The plaintiff is attempting to use Mr. Kellerman's affidavit as the sole basis for seizing a $1.2 million property. Without the ability to cross-examine the witness, his affidavit cannot be admitted as undisputed fact. If you deny my right to cross-examine, I formally request that his affidavit be stricken from the record entirely. The courtroom went dead silent. Arthur Vance's smug smile vanished. He blinked, looking at Dennis as if the high school teacher had just started speaking fluent Mandarin. Judge Simmons' jaw tightened. Dennis had just correctly and flawlessly cited the hearsay rule, putting her in a legal bind. If she denied him the cross-examination and accepted the affidavit anyway, it was an automatic, glaring ground for appeal, one that even a corrupt judge couldn't easily justify on the record. Fine, Simmons spat, glaring daggers at Dennis. Mr. Vance, is your engineer in the building? He is in the hall, Your Honor, Vance mumbled, visibly flustered. Bring him in, Simmons ordered. Mr. Washington, you have 5 minutes to question him. And if you ask a single irrelevant question, I am shutting you down. Dennis nodded politely. 5 minutes is all I need, Your Honor. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. David Kellerman, a nervous-looking man in a rumpled gray suit, took the stand. He was a contractor on Apex Horizons' payroll, paid handsomely to find critical flaws in properties Apex wanted to steal. He swore an oath, looking to Arthur Vance for reassurance. Vance gave him a subtle nod. Dennis approached the podium. He didn't carry notes. He just looked at Kellerman with the calm, piercing gaze of a teacher waiting for a student to confess to cheating. Mr. Kellerman, you authored the engineering report dated October 12, claiming the foundation of my property at 402 Elm Street is critically compromised, correct? Dennis asked. Yes. That is correct, Kellerman replied, projecting false confidence. There are severe microfractures in the concrete. The building is a hazard. I see, Dennis said. He walked back to his table and picked up a single sheet of paper. I have here the meteorological data for the month of October from the National Weather Service. It is submitted as Defense Exhibit C. According to this data, it rained heavily for 6 consecutive days leading up to, and including, October 12th. Kellerman frowned. Okay. And Dennis continued, his voice echoing clearly, my property has a sealed, subterranean basement. To inspect the foundation for microfractures, one would need to access the exterior basement walls, which requires excavating at least 4 feet of earth. Did you operate heavy excavation machinery in a torrential downpour, in the middle of a city street, without pulling a municipal excavation permit? Vance shot up from his chair. Objection. Relevance. The witness's methods are not on trial. Overruled, Simmons snapped, looking annoyed at Vance. Just answer the question, Mr. Kellerman, so we can get this over with. We conducted a visual inspection from the interior, Kellerman stammered, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. A visual inspection of the interior drywall? Dennis asked, raising an eyebrow. You determined the structural integrity of a concrete foundation by looking at interior plaster? We used specialized tools, Kellerman lied, his eyes darting toward Vance. I see, Dennis said softly. He stepped closer to the witness stand. Mr. Kellerman, I want to remind you that you are under oath. Perjury in a civil proceeding involving property values over $1 million is a Class 3 felony under state law. Are you aware of that? Objection. He is badgering the witness, Vance yelled. Sustained. Mr. Washington, back off, Simmons warned, gripping her gavel. My apologies, Your Honor, Dennis said smoothly. He pivoted smoothly, moving exactly to the spot he had planned. Mr. Kellerman, let's talk about your compensation. You are paid as an independent contractor for Apex Horizon, correct? Yes. And in the last 4 years, you have provided exactly 14 property assessments for Apex Horizon, all resulting in blight declarations, all resulting in the properties being transferred to Crestview Holdings LLC. Is that correct? Vance jumped up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Objection. Your Honor, this is wildly outside the scope of this hearing. Crestview Holdings is a completely separate entity. This is an egregious fishing expedition. Judge Simmons' face suddenly drained of color. The mention of Crestview Holdings hit her like a physical blow. Her eyes snapped toward Dennis, panic briefly flashing behind her designer glasses before she masked it with intense rage. Sustained. Simmons shouted, slamming her gavel down. Mr. Washington, you are entirely out of line. The business dealings of third-party corporations have absolutely no bearing on the structural integrity of your building. Strike the last question from the record. If you mention Crestview Holdings again, I will hold you in contempt of court. Dennis did not back down. He stood his ground, radiating an aura of total control. He was no longer the defendant, he was the prosecutor. Your Honor, Dennis said, his voice dropping an octave, commanding the room. The business dealings of Crestview Holdings are the only thing that has bearing on this case. I am attempting to establish a pattern of fraudulent RICO activity, and I have the right to impeach the credibility of a witness who is part of that enterprise. RICO? Vance laughed loudly, looking around the courtroom. Your Honor, the man is deranged. He thinks he's in a mafia movie. I am holding you in contempt, Mr. Washington. Judge Simmons roared, her composure completely shattering. Bailiff, take this man into custody. I am granting the plaintiff's summary judgment immediately. You cannot grant a judgment, Your Honor, Dennis said, raising his voice just enough to overpower hers. He reached into his binder and pulled out a stack of documents stamped with the seal of the First National Bank. Because under the Supreme Court precedent of Caperton v. A.T., Massey Coal Co., you are legally required to recuse yourself from this case immediately, and anything you rule today is null and void. The courtroom froze. The bailiff, who had taken 2 steps toward Dennis, stopped in his tracks, unsure of what to do. A pro se litigant citing Supreme Court precedent to demand a judge's recusal mid-trial was something that simply did not happen. Arthur Vance stared at Dennis, his mouth slightly open. The junior lawyers were paralyzed. Judge Simmons was breathing heavily, her hands gripping the edge of her bench so tightly her knuckles were white. What did you just say to me? She whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of absolute fury and rising terror. Dennis held up the stack of bank documents. This is Defense Exhibit F. It is a certified response to a subpoena deuces to come I legally executed upon First National Bank. These are the wire transfer records for Crestview Holdings LLC for the past 4 years. I did not authorize any such subpoena. Simmons yelled, her judicial facade crumbling completely. This is illegal discovery. It is inadmissible. You didn't have to authorize it, Your Honor, Dennis replied calmly. Under Rule 45 of Civil Procedure, as an officer of the court acting pro se, I filed it directly with the clerk of courts, who signed and issued it under the court seal because the request was properly formatted and legally sound. The bank complied. It is completely legal, and it is entirely admissible. Vance scrambled out from behind his desk. Your Honor, we move to quash this subpoena retroactively. We move to strike. This is a blatant violation of privacy. Privacy to commit fraud, Mr. Vance? Dennis shot back, his eyes flashing. He turned to the court reporter, a young woman whose fingers were flying across her stenotype machine. Let the record reflect that Defense Exhibit F shows a clear and unbroken chain of payments. Every time Apex Horizon successfully seized a property in this courtroom, a wire transfer of exactly $50,000 was made from Apex Horizon to Crestview Holdings LLC. Stop typing. Judge Simmons screamed at the court reporter. Do not record that. The court reporter looked up, terrified, her hands hovering over the keys. If you stop typing, you are an accessory to federal obstruction of justice, Dennis told the reporter softly, but firmly. Keep typing. The reporter, pale and shaking, lowered her hands and continued typing. Dennis turned back to the judge. The moment of absolute destruction had arrived. Your Honor, according to the incorporation documents filed in the state of Delaware, which I have also subpoenaed and are included in Exhibit F, Crestview Holdings LLC has one managing member. Richard Simmons. Your husband. The gasp from the gallery was audible. Even the bailiff let out a low whistle. Arthur Vance slowly sank back into his chair, the blood draining from his face as he realized his law firm was inextricably tied to a massive judicial bribery scandal. He began physically inching his chair away from the plaintiff's table, mentally preparing his defense to the state bar. You are lying, Simmons gasped, though her terrified eyes betrayed the truth. This is a fabrication. This is contempt. I am calling the police. I already called them, Your Honor, Dennis said, stepping up to the plaintiff's table and slamming the thick stack of financial documents down right in front of Arthur Vance. At 8 a.m. this morning, I delivered a duplicate binder of these exact documents to the Public Corruption Unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I also filed a formal complaint with the State Judicial Ethics Board and the State Bar Association. Dennis looked up at the bench. He wasn't a desperate man fighting an eviction anymore. He was the executioner, and the blade had already fallen. Under Caperton vous, a.t. Massey Cole Co., your failure to recuse yourself from a case where you have a direct, undisclosed financial interest is a violation of my due process rights under the 14th Amendment. Furthermore, your actions constitute conspiracy to commit wire fraud under Title 18, U.S. Code, Section 1346. Dennis picked up his pen and pointed it at her. You didn't just laugh at me, Your Honor. You laughed at the law. You assumed because I didn't have an expensive suit or a law degree, I was stupid, but you left a paper trail a mile wide. I move for an immediate mistrial with prejudice. And if you attempt to rule against me, I will add judicial retaliation to your federal indictment. For what felt like an eternity, the courtroom was suspended in a vacuum of silence. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a sledgehammer striking an anvil. Judge Nicole Simmons looked down at the man she had mocked just 30 minutes prior. She was a woman who had built an entire career on the illusion of invulnerability. She played golf with mayors, dined with state senators, and sneered at the working class from her elevated mahogany throne. Now, her empire was burning to the ground, ignited by a high school history teacher with a thrift store suit and an unmatched intellect. She looked at Arthur Vance for help. Arthur, she whispered. Vance, however, was a creature of pure self-preservation. He immediately stood up, holding his hands up defensively. Your Honor, Apex Horizon and my firm had absolutely no knowledge of the ownership structure of Crestview Holdings. We were contracted to litigate property disputes. If there were illicit financial transfers, they were executed by rogue executives within Apex without our counsel. I formally request to withdraw as counsel for the plaintiff immediately. Vance was throwing his own clients, and the judge, directly under the bus to save his law license. You coward, Simmons hissed. It's called mitigating liability, Nicole, Vance snapped back, dropping the Your Honor entirely. Dennis stood perfectly still, watching the rats turn on each other as the ship sank. He didn't gloat. He didn't cheer. He simply waited for the procedure to conclude. Your Honor, Dennis prompted, his voice cutting through their bickering. I have a motion for a mistrial with prejudice pending. The law requires a ruling. Judge Simmons looked at Dennis. Her face was hollow, her eyes empty. The sheer, overwhelming weight of her impending reality was crashing down on her, the FBI, the media, the disgrace, the loss of her pension, her freedom, her reputation. Everything was gone, destroyed by her own greed and arrogance. Her hand reached out, trembling uncontrollably, and picked up her wooden gavel. She held it in the air for a moment. It felt impossibly heavy. Motion. Simmons choked out, tears of pure terror welling in her eyes. Motion for mistrial, with prejudice, is granted. The case against the Washington estate is dismissed. She didn't bang the gavel. It simply slipped from her numb fingers, clattering loudly onto the desk and rolling off the edge, hitting the floor with a hollow thud that echoed through the silent courtroom. Judge Simmons stood up, her legs visibly shaking, and stumbled back into her chambers without another word. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind her. The courtroom remained completely silent for another 10 seconds before erupting into chaos. The junior lawyers were frantically packing their briefcases. The gallery observers were whispering fiercely. The bailiff walked over to Dennis, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "Mr. Washington," the bailiff said softly. "I've been working in this courthouse for 22 years. I have never, in my life, seen anything like what you just did." Dennis finally let out a long, slow breath. The tension left his shoulders. He carefully packed his binder, his highlighters, and his notes back into his worn leather satchel. "I teach my students that history isn't just about dates and battles," Dennis said to the bailiff, offering a small, tired smile. "It's about the fact that no empire lasts forever, especially the corrupt ones." He turned and walked back down the center aisle, pushing through the heavy oak doors and out into the bright afternoon sun. He had won. He had saved his mother's home. But more importantly, he had brought down a tyrant. The fallout was swifter and more brutal than anyone could have anticipated. Dennis had not bluffed about the FBI. He had delivered an absolute masterclass in forensic accounting to the Public Corruption Unit, handing them a perfectly packaged criminal case with a bow on top. By 6 a.m. the following Tuesday, a fleet of black SUVs surrounded the sprawling suburban mansion of Judge Nicole Simmons and her husband, Richard. Agents in tactical gear executed a federal search warrant, seizing computers, hard drives, banking tokens, and boxes of financial records. Neighbors watched in shock as the arrogant, untouchable judge was led out of her home in handcuffs, her face pale and devoid of makeup, hiding from the flashing cameras of local news crews. The local news networks exploded. The story of a corrupt judge running a real estate extortion ring with corporate developers dominated the headlines for weeks. But what captured the public's imagination the most was the identity of the man who took her down. The media dubbed Dennis the pro se prodigy. Within 48 hours of her arrest, the state Supreme Court indefinitely suspended Judge Simmons without pay. 2 weeks later, the state bar officially disbarred her. The investigation triggered a massive domino effect. Apex Horizon Development was raided next. Federal agents uncovered emails between the company's CEO and Richard Simmons, explicitly detailing the kickback scheme. They paid Judge Simmons to rule in their favor, allowing them to steal millions of dollars in real estate from vulnerable citizens. Arthur Vance, the arrogant corporate lawyer, was heavily investigated. While he managed to avoid federal prison by cooperating and turning state's evidence against his former clients, his reputation was decimated. His firm fired him, and he was forced into early, disgraced retirement. As for Judge Nicole Simmons, there was no leniency. The federal prosecutor, eager to make a public example of judicial corruption, charged her with 22 counts of wire fraud, conspiracy, and deprivation of civil rights under color of law. Facing decades in prison, her expensive defense attorneys advised her to take a plea deal. 9 months after she laughed at Dennis Washington in her courtroom, former Judge Nicole Simmons stood in a federal courthouse. She was no longer wearing a black robe. She wore a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. She pleaded guilty to federal racketeering charges. The federal judge presiding over her sentencing looked down at her with absolute disgust. "Miss Simmons, you were entrusted with the most sacred duty in our society, to act as an impartial arbiter of justice," the judge stated, his voice echoing through the packed courtroom. "Instead, you weaponized the bench to line your own pockets, preying on the very citizens you swore to protect. You mocked the rule of law. It is the sentence of this court that you serve 15 years in federal prison, without the possibility of early parole." Simmons collapsed into tears as the U.S. Marshals led her away. There was no laughter this time. Only the cold, brutal reality of hard karma. Dennis Washington's life changed dramatically, but he never let the success change his core. Following the exposure of the conspiracy, Dennis did not just walk away with his mother's property secured. He filed a massive civil rights lawsuit against Apex Horizon and the municipality that enabled them, utilizing the federal statute 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, which allows citizens to sue for civil rights violations committed under the color of state law. Because the federal criminal convictions provided ironclad proof of the conspiracy, Apex Horizon's board of directors panicked. Desperate to avoid a drawn-out, public civil trial that could bankrupt the entire conglomerate, they settled out of court. Dennis received a settlement of $8.5 million. The money was more than he could spend in a lifetime. He renovated his mother's historic property, turning it into a beautiful community center and library for the neighborhood. But his greatest legacy was what he did with the rest of the funds. Dennis quit his job as a high school history teacher, though he always missed the classroom. He took the LSAT, scored in the 99th percentile, and was offered a full-ride scholarship to an elite law school. But he didn't need their money. He paid his own way, graduated at the top of his class, and passed the bar exam on his first try. He didn't join a corporate firm. He didn't seek out a corner office with a view of the city. Instead, Dennis used his multi-million-dollar settlement to found the Washington Legal Aid Clinic. He hired a team of aggressive, brilliant young lawyers dedicated to representing the underprivileged, the vulnerable, and the people the system actively tried to crush. His clinic became a fortress for the working class. If a slumlord tried to illegally evict a single mother, the Washington Clinic was there. If a predatory lender tried to seize a family farm, Dennis Washington was there, walking into the courtroom in his sharp, tailored suits, armed with an encyclopedic knowledge of the law and a reputation that made opposing counsel sweat. Years later, a plaque was hung in the lobby of his legal clinic. It was a simple bronze square with a quote from the man who had defeated a corrupt empire using nothing but a library card and an unbreakable will. The law is not a weapon for the powerful, it is a shield for the righteous, and the truth is the heaviest gavel of all. Absolute arrogance had met absolute brilliance. And in the end, true justice, hard, poetic, and undeniable had the final, echoing laugh. Did that courtroom showdown leave you speechless? Dennis Washington proved that with relentless dedication, the truth can shatter even the highest pedestals of corruption. If you loved seeing arrogant Judge Simmons get a massive dose of hard karma and watched a brilliant underdog rewrite the rules of the game, hit that like button right now. It helps us bring more incredible true-to-life stories of justice and revenge directly to your screen. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Have you ever faced down an unfair system?